Suffering is a difficult topic for us to talk about as Americans. And the truth is that Americans do not suffer well because Americans often do not suffer very much. And we know this. We know this because our infant mortality rate is some of the lowest among all the countries of the world. Our incomes are the highest among many countries of the world. We have nonprofits that help people in difficult times to get through their tough times. Life is pretty easy for most Americans in our country. Let me give you some examples of the ease of life that we often enjoy as Americans. We have cars that take us to places we want to go, and those cars will even tell us how to get where we want to go if we don't know how. Right? Why walk somewhere? Why take a horse when you can drive a car? It's much easier. And not just that, we have garages that keep our cars nice and warm. Why would you want to scrape ice off of your windshield when you can keep your car in the garage and keep it warm and make it easier to get in and drive? Another thing that makes our life easy is dishwashers. Right? Why spend 15 minutes washing those dishes by hand when you can put them in the dishwasher and it will do it for you in a shorter period of time? Another example of our ease of life is how we use banks. Right? Why would we want to spend time putting our money in a coffee can, bury it in the backyard when we can take it to a bank? And not only will they keep it for us, but they will give us interest money when we let them keep it for us. Another good example of our ease of life as Americans. A last one is our washing machines and dryers. We don't have to drive down to Moses Lake with the washboard to wash our clothes and then bring them back to our house and hang them up to dry them. We have washing machines and dryers to do all of that. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of those things that I've listed for you. I intentionally chose 5 things that I use in my household every single day. There's nothing wrong with those things, but those things do affect us, and they train our mind to think of easiness. They train our worldview to look for convenience. They train us to look for and expect easy answers and easy solutions to often complex problems. To paraphrase Pastor Tim Keller that passed away recently, in his book titled Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, in the first chapter, he says this, I'm paraphrasing it a little bit, but he says, suffering is traumatic in America because our pursuit is of personal pleasure and personal freedom. Suffering is hard for us because that's kind of what we focus on, pleasure and personal freedom. Americans focus on that, and that pursuit of pleasure and personal freedom sometimes shapes how we view God. 100 pages later in that same book, as he's developed that more, he says this. He says, often the unstated assumption of many people is that God's job is to create a world in which things benefit us. And that's why suffering is so hard for us as Americans. When our life is wrapped up in always looking for easy solutions, easy convenience, ease of life, when we hit a bump in the road or we hit a struggle, we don't really like that because everything we experience is taught for us to look for easy solutions and convenience. And if there's one thing that the book of 1 Peter has been teaching us as we're going through it and have been going through it, is that we have learned a lot about suffering and how to suffer as believers. The whole book is really about suffering. The word suffering or synonyms for suffering is mentioned 20 times in just these 5 short chapters. Peter's been giving us a correct view of suffering, and in that way also a correct view of God and a theology of God. And these last verses we're going to look at today, he's going to finish with some thoughts about Satan, the battle we experience against Satan, the struggles that we're in, and then give 3 verses as a summation at the very end, a few final words to them. And as Peter writes this, he talks about Satan and how these people need to prepare for battle against Satan. He says in verses 8 and 9, "Be sober, be of sober spirit, be on alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world." Now, in these two verses, Peter describes our adversary as well as our actions we need to have against that adversary. And he describes Satan there, as I said, as the adversary. That comes from an old word that means an opponent in a lawsuit. And then he describes Satan as the devil, which means slanderer. And Peter uses the image and the metaphor of a lion to describe what Satan does on earth against Christians. Now, a lion, as you may know, is normally active during the day, but when it gets persecuted or things are tough, it often will hunt during the twilight times or at night. They can run very fast, up to 46 miles an hour, but they cannot run for a very long period of time, which means they need to sneak up on their prey and they need to get close to their prey. They need to use trees and bushes to hide as they approach, or if they're going to try to kill a gazelle, they try to find the gazelle when it's on a little bit of a hill so they can kind of creep up the valley below and sneak up on it. That's the image of a lion. And see, it's important for us because Satan doesn't often show up plainly or clearly. It'd be much easier to do battle against him if we knew where he was every single time. But instead, he uses certain methods and tactics, and he's subtle and sly. He even gets behind certain people or political leaders and props them up and uses them to accomplish his will, which is the main thing that Ezekiel describes in chapter 28 with the king of Tyre. How Satan is controlling this king and using this king to accomplish what he wants. So that's the adversary that Peter describes. Satan is like a lion, but he also describes some actions that you and I need to have as we face that adversary. The first action is that we need to be sober and respect him, which is in verse 8. Peter says, "Be of sober spirit." This describes our attitude. Someone I know that works for the utility district has told me that when they get new electricians in their first days of training, the first thing they do is they train them on the power of electricity, safety training. They tell them, before you can handle it, you have to respect it. And they show them the power of electricity and how much it takes to kill a person, and how when they touch it, because it sends electrical pulses through their body, it tenses all of their muscles and they literally cannot let go. And that same principle is here. Peter describes our attitude, that we need to respect Satan and acknowledge his place that he has roaming the earth, and the minions, the demons that work for him, that follow his mandates and his commands. So we need to be sober and respect him. And second, we need to be alert and recognize him, as Peter's second action. He says, "Be on alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." This describes our discernment we need to have. That word for be on alert comes from a word that means to be awake or to arouse someone. We have to be on guard and carefully look for him. Just as a lion likes to subtly and slyly use bushes and trees and the terrain to sneak up on its prey, we also have to be in that same mindset to look for how Satan might use certain situations to sneak up on us. When it's been a really stressful day or a stressful week, and we might be tempted after we have one beer or one glass of alcohol to have a second or third, right? It was a stressful week. I deserve a little extra to take the edge off. Or maybe if we have some painkillers that were given to us for an injury that we didn't use all of them, and a little later on we think, I kind of liked how those felt. They put me at ease. Maybe I'll enjoy the rest of that bottle even though I don't have that same pain anymore. Or maybe when there's a fight with our spouse and we get upset and we're trying to get over it, so we decide to enjoy a little porn to take that pressure off. Or instead of going out and spending times with friends or people at church, we think, well, I have friends on Facebook, and that's my community. I don't need any real friends in person. Those are the subtle ways that Satan gets in situations and uses them to hurt us and manipulate us. So we need to be alert and recognize him. Third, we need to be ready and resist him. This is what Peter addresses in verse 9. But resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. Well, that first action described our attitude. The second one described the discernment we need to have. Here, these are specific things we need to do. Our actions. We need to resist Satan. This is a defensive position that we take against his attacks upon us. And we take that defensive position first with a strong faith, where we claim the promises of God and his word, just as we sang earlier. But we also know the doctrine described in God's word, and we have that close to us. Pastor Warren Wiersbe has said, the better we know God's word, the keener our spiritual senses will be to detect Satan at work. So we need a strong faith, but we also need a strong family. A family of believers in a church setting like this, or a small group Bible study, or maybe some close friends at work where we're all believers and we can stick together. Or if we gather for a family gathering and there's 10 or 12 family members, sometimes it's nice to know there's 2 or 3 Christians. You can kind of find a little consolation too at certain parts of those Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners. A strong faith and a strong family helps us resist Satan. And while those are things we're told to do in verses 8 and 9, I think there's a principle we can take away from this. And it's that trouble and suffering that we experience is because of Satan, not because of us. Trouble and suffering is because of Satan, not us. It's important for us to remember that Satan is the origin of evil and sin and wickedness in the world. In Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 15, we learn about Satan and how unrighteousness was found in him. That's the beginning of sin and evil and wickedness that has gone into our world. It is because of him and his actions, and how he took a third of the angels with him when he left heaven. And now they are his demons that follow his mandates to cause harm against God's people. Trouble and suffering is because of Satan, not because of us. Sometimes people suffer and there's nothing they do to cause it. Family members get cancer and die. Friends have accidents at work and they don't come home. Husbands get abusive or cheat, or they leave when we wish they would have stayed. Babies die in the womb of their mother. Those are all examples. People don't do anything wrong. They suffer, but it's because of Satan and what he started in the world in which we live that we have to experience that suffering. And that's what's sometimes hard when we walk with other people through suffering, when we know they haven't done anything wrong. But that's why it's important that we're with them and we walk with them through that suffering, to remind them of God's care for them and to remind them that they didn't do anything wrong, that suffering is because of Satan and what he has started and the effects of the world. Peter moves on from talking about Satan in verses 8 and 9 to the struggles these believers are in verses 10 and 11. He says, after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. To him be dominion forever and ever. Amen. In these 2 verses, Peter's describing the suffering that they're experiencing is temporary, right? That this suffering, it's part of God's temporary timeline in verse 10. He says, after you have suffered for a little while. That's a gentle reminder he's giving to these people that suffering they're going through, according to God's timeline, according to God's eternal timeline, it is suffering for a short period of time, according to God's timeline. Suffering still hurts, it's still hard, but it is temporary, Peter tells them. And he tells them that their suffering they're going through is not just temporary, but it's part of God's call in verse 10. After you've suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ. See, there's a sense in Scripture that God knows us and he selects us to be part of his family. And Peter has done that throughout his letter, starting actually in chapter 1, verse 1, about this call on these believers that he is writing to. In chapter 1, he calls them, in verse 1, resident aliens scattered in these 5 regions. You who are chosen, he says in verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1, according to the foreknowledge of God. Then in verse 15 of chapter 1, he again says, you are to be like the Holy One who has chosen you. Then in chapter 2, verse 9, after he's talking about Israel and God's election of Israel in the Old Testament, he changes it and flips it to these people. He says, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood. And then here in chapter, there's one more actually, in chapter 2, verse 21, for you have been called for this purpose, referring to the suffering they've been going through. And then here he tells them, after you've suffered for a little while, the God of all grace who called you to his eternal glory. See, Peter reminds us in this letter that our salvation is because of God's grace and that he called us into a relationship with him. And this is important because if they are called into that relationship with God, it means God has placed them where he wants them. He knows what they're going through. And it's not an accident that they are suffering in this way. So the suffering is part of God's temporary timeline, it's part of God's call, but it's also part of his work there at the very end of verse 10. It says, Christ will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. These words describe God's resoluteness to work in us and grow us through those struggles, and he'll produce a strength of character that grows us. Then verse 11 reads, to him be dominion forever and ever. Amen. It's almost like a doxology or dismissal, except 3 verses early here in verse 11. But what he's saying is God has given us enough power and ability to endure the suffering that he allows us to go through. He's telling these people their confidence should be in Christ. They should not be cocky in their flesh. Proverbs 21:31 reads, the horse is prepared for the day of battle, but victory belongs to the Lord. Our suffering is temporary, but God's grace and glory that we will enjoy will be with him eternally. Right? That he has a purpose in those things. Romans 8:18 says, Paul writes, for I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. That suffering they're going through in verse 10 is temporary, but that Lord that is putting them through that suffering in verse 11, he is eternal. And the believers that suffer through the things God lets them go through, they will experience an eternal glory with God forever. So just as we had this takeaway earlier in verses 8 and 9 that trouble and suffering is because of Satan, not us, I think we can say, based on verses 10 and 11, endurance in suffering is because of God, not us. Our endurance in suffering is because of God, not us. See, if God is the one to allow us to experience suffering, then God is the one that is going to help us endure that same suffering. When we follow him and we trust him, it's not about how tough we are to get through situations or how clever we are to come up with creative ways to get through our suffering. We look to him and rely on him and trust him to take us through what he has put us in. And this is great because it takes the pressure off of us. We don't have to think, how am I going to get through this difficult situation? We don't have to ask that question. Instead, we can say, it's going to be interesting to see how God works this out. Notice how the subtle little shift is there. It's not on us and the burden of us to get through it, but we redirect our attention to God and trust Him to help us and to follow Him through it. One study Bible I came across this week says this: Christians are to live with the understanding that God's purposes realized in the future require some pain in the present. While the believer is being personally attacked by the enemy, he is being personally perfected by the Lord. Just as Peter writes there at the end of verse 10, Christ Himself will perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. Our endurance and suffering is because of God, not because of us. Peter ends this letter with verses 12, 13, and 14, this summation where he talks about the community that you kind of get a feel is with him as he writes this. Verse 12, he writes, "Through Silvanus, our faithful brother, for so I regard him, I have written to you briefly, exhorting and testifying that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it. She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark. Greet one another with a kiss of love. Peace be to you, all who are in Christ," he says. Now, as we see this letter coming to a close, there's a few people that are mentioned. The first person mentioned is Peter's amanuensis, is the fancy word that people call Silvanus. Peter's amanuensis. My translation calls him Silvanus. If you have an NIV or a New Living Translation, NLT, it'll translate it Silas. The same Silas we read in the book of Acts, that is most likely this guy, Silvanus. Silvanus is the Latin name, and Silas is the Greek name of this man. This man became a Christian at the church in Jerusalem. He was prophetically gifted. He was sent to Antioch to do ministry there. He traveled with Paul on Paul's second missionary journey. And he's mentioned several times as a companion of Paul in Paul's letters. And the thing we need to figure out here is in verse 12 at the beginning when it says, "Through Silvanus, I have written to you." Now, what does that mean, through Silvanus? There are two views. Could be one, could be other. It could be a little mix of each. One view is that Silvanus was Peter's amanuensis. In the New Testament, not everybody could read, obviously. Not everybody could write. So there is a group of professionals who were scribes and amanuenses where they would write letters on behalf of other people. Someone would dictate it, and they would write it down on the papyrus in ink and pass it on. That's one possible role of Silvanus here. It makes sense when we read other parts of the New Testament, especially Paul, where he says, "I'm writing this with my own hand." It's a sense he takes that pen and that ink from the amanuensis and he writes in his own handwriting. So Silvanus could be Peter's amanuensis, writing these things on his behalf. He also could be the man that is delivering this letter. If Peter's writing from Rome, it's about 1,000 miles to get to Asia Minor where these believers are. So Silvanus could be the man literally carrying this letter, or he could be a person that did both. Either way, he is with Peter as Peter writes this. The next group of people we see are Peter's companions in verse 13. Referring to the church. He says, "She who is in Babylon." Now that phrase for Babylon likely describes the church in an encrypted, figurative way. I think it's a metaphor to describe Rome. Just as Babylon in the Old Testament was this kind of arch enemy against Israel when it was regularly persecuting Israel and causing issues to Israel. Now in the New Testament in the first century, Babylon is gone. They're not really even a country. No one really even lives in that city. But Rome is figuratively coming against the New Testament church in the same way Babylon used to come against the nation of Israel. And Peter is using this as a figurative way to describe the political city of Rome and how they're persecuting the church just as Babylon persecuted Israel. And Peter's letter is peppered with different metaphors that he uses to write. In chapter 1, verse 2, he talks about these believers that are sprinkled with the blood of Christ. They probably weren't literally sprinkled with Christ's blood, but it's a figure of speech to describe how they were saved through Christ's death. In chapter 2, Peter says, you all need to desire the milk of God's word. We're not really drinking God's word as milk, but it's a figure of speech to say it gives us nourishment and helps us. Earlier in this chapter, Peter talked about the elders, and he tells them to shepherd the flock, right? A figurative way to describe the job description of an elder or a pastor is to act like a shepherd. And even in verses 8 and 9, Peter describes Satan as a lion. Satan is not literally a lion, but he does function in that way. It's Peter's metaphors and images he uses to communicate. And he's doing that same thing here with Rome. Right? And I know I've given you a little more explanation, but I just always want to be cautious when you read something and I tell you it doesn't mean what it says. I want to explain to you why it doesn't mean what it says, if that makes sense. I know it's a little more detail than probably necessary, but I just want to be cautious with that. And Peter, again, as he's talking about that church in Babylon, in Rome, he references their calling, that she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you. And then Peter mentions a third person or a third group. My son Mark, he says, sends them greetings. This is the same guy, Mark, that wrote the Gospel of Mark we have in our Bible. Tradition, early church historians and church fathers tell us that Mark's gospel was based on Peter's eyewitness testimony, so this matches up to that. The same Mark that had started some missionary journeys with Paul and Barnabas, but then quit, and Paul and Barnabas have a split over Mark. That's the same guy. But apparently Mark is there in Rome with Peter on this occasion. And Peter ends in verse 14. Greet one another with a kiss of love. Peace be to you, all who are in Christ. That kiss was a common sign of fellowship and Christian love. In the first couple centuries after this was written, we have tradition that tells us this kiss was done in the church. Don't get too excited, but it was only to the same sex. So guys, you can only kiss other guys. Ladies, you can only give other ladies a kiss on the cheek, so don't get too excited when you read this kiss of love. But that's at least how the first and second century church practiced these commands. And he finishes with peace. That peace was the same way that Peter began his letter, chapter 1, verse 2, in which he told these Christians who were in the midst of persecution and suffering to seek the Prince of Peace and to enjoy the peace that he provides. So as we come to the end of this letter, we've had a few takeaways: that trouble and suffering is because of Satan, not us. Endurance and suffering is because of God, not us. Lastly, as we read verses 12, 13, and 14, we see perseverance and suffering is easier with others. Peter is in Rome, but he is not alone. He has a group of people with him, the church, Silvanus, Mark. Community is needed, especially in hard times and suffering. Jerry Bridges has a good book. He had a long ministry in the Navigators, a good parachurch ministry. He has a book called True Community, where he says this: God has created us to be dependent both on Him and one another. None of us has the spiritual wherewithal to go it alone in our Christian lives, he says. Spiritual fellowship is not a luxury, but a necessity, vital to our spiritual growth and health. One of the most important things we can share with one another is the spiritual truth God has been teaching us that might be part of the great help that other believers need. See, when we gather together, for example, on Sundays, it's not just about looking at a screen and singing songs or listening to a sermon given from God's Word, but it's about us connecting with each other encouraging one another and being with one another, asking each other how things are going. That's why we have a potluck where we get to sit down and talk for an extended period of time in addition to just our Sunday worship. That's why small group Bible studies are good as well, or even one-on-one discipleship. See, some people you've heard say, and I've heard say, they say, I read my Bible, I pray, I watch a few sermons on TV or YouTube. I don't need the church, they say. But the truth is that I know you know is that the church needs them, right? We need those people here. We need to hear how God is working in their lives. We need to hear how God is walking with them through suffering. We need to hear about how their spouse died 10 years ago, yet God has ministered to them and been with them every step of the way. They might not need the church, but the church needs them. Perseverance in suffering is easier with others. As Peter wrote this, likely in 64 AD, we can know that the church for almost 2,000 years has gone through lots of fiery trials and difficult, painful times. Each trial instigated by Satan and his demons, pushed on by them, but God's people have endured and made it through. And I hope we can have that same hope and confidence when trials and suffering and difficulties come into our lives. If 2,000 years of Christians have made it through, then we can make it through too. And I hope 1 Peter can be a book that we go to in our times of suffering, or if we're walking with others through suffering, they can go to 1 Peter to look for help and encouragement. Maybe a difficult marriage, a frustrating job, a financial burden, or a wayward child that we feel overwhelmed with. However big or little, God has called you to faith in Him. He's allowed you to be in the situation you're facing, and He will enable you to endure it. Let's pray. God, thank you for these words from 1 Peter. Some people in our church, Lord, you know, suffering is not a theory for them, but it is reality that they are experiencing. I pray you would minister to them, that you would speak to them and walk with them through those difficult times. Put people in their life to encourage them. Put people in their life to listen to them, to help them. I pray you would use us as a church, maybe people that aren't even part of our community here, that you would use us to help other people in their suffering too, to point them to God in the midst of their difficult times, and to share our faith with them. Not a faith of come to you and the problems will be solved, but a faith of come to you and God will give you new problems, but the good news is He'll help you with those problems. I pray for our church in this time and for those that can't be with us because of their various commitments and health issues and family obligations. Please be with them and minister to them. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So at this time, if you're able to, I'll invite you to stand for a benediction. And then we'll be dismissed. After you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace who called you to His eternal glory in Christ will Himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. To Him be dominion forever and ever. Amen.